Hello, I'm Wayne Welsh.
And I'm Joseph Venuso.
And today we're going to be talking about Exodus chapter 1, in which we meet Pharaoh, a new king of Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And we'll see how well it goes for the people of Israel. It doesn't. The beginning of Exodus chapter 1, the first 7 verses are a list of names. In fact, in Hebrew, the book is known as the book called Names. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and multiplied, and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them.
Yeah, again, we talked in our intro video about how Exodus follows up right where Genesis leaves off, and it kind of starts out with the promises to Abraham, the fact that they are fruitful and multiply. Kind of that big part of Genesis is the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here, this is just pulling that forward of, well, here's that they're this great population now. And then, well, that makes us think, well, what about the land promise? What about the other promises that were made to them? And then Exodus takes us from there.
Yeah, it's worth, I think, thinking back to one of the things that God said to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 15. In Genesis 15, God appears to Abraham in a vision, the smoking oven, a burning torch, things like that. And one of the things God says is in Genesis 15:13 is, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions." So, right at the start, we're reading Exodus 1, they're using language of the promise. They were fruitful and multiplied. But we also see that they're strangers in a land that is not theirs. And all of that previous generation is dying, and so now our mind kind of thinks back to what God said to Abraham in Genesis 15. And are they going to be oppressed? Are they going to become slaves? Well, for that, we keep going. We keep reading.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and pick up there, verse 8. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.' Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves."
Yeah, so this is starting off right away. You think back to what Joseph did for the Egyptians in saving their land from famine. But now a new king has arrived who doesn't know Joseph. It's possible this is even a straight-up dynasty changeover. Egypt went through a series of different dynasties, and this is the beginning of a new dynasty, a new pharaoh, a new king who's in charge of things. The exact pharaoh that this is, it's a little difficult to determine because the Bible doesn't really name a lot of the pharaohs. It just generically refers to all of them as Pharaoh. It isn't until you get to the divided kingdom period and the Iron Age where you start seeing some specific guys like Shishak and Necho and so on. And who you think the Pharaoh of Egypt is going to be inevitably tied to when you think the Exodus happened, which is a discussion that probably is better suited for another video.
Yeah, we in these videos that as we go through Exodus, we'll get in the weeds about some things, but for things like when the Exodus happened and all of that, or we talked about authorship and introduction a little bit just as a reference, but there's a lot of discussions on those things, and we want this to be more of a devotional thing rather than entirely academic.
Right. We'll be
So-
fiercely non-committal about it.
Yeah.
Of course, we can make the video on the date of the Exodus, and then I'll still be fiercely non-committal about
Yeah,
it. So,
yeah.
But one of the things I think is kind of the key to understanding this is the echoes of an earlier text. Because you look at what's going on, Pharaoh sees a situation. He's thinking, this is a bad situation. How can I fix it? I know what we'll do. I'll have these people use brick and mortar and build cities for me. Well, this is all an echo of a much earlier story from Genesis, in Genesis chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 11, men began to multiply on the face of the earth. The whole earth uses the same language and the same words. They, in verse 3, say, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they use brick for stone, and they use tar for mortar, same vocabulary we see in Exodus. Then they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So there's this concern with being scattered over the face of the earth. The solution is to build cities, to make bricks for mortar and tar, and to build a tower. And then God intervenes and acts in judgment. When we come to Exodus, and it's the same thing. Pharaoh notices that the sons of Israel are multiplying, and they're getting stronger than we are. We have to do something about it. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply in the event of war. And then they make bricks and mortar, and build cities. Pharaoh is a king of Babylon, which is a bit funny because Pharaoh is actually the king of Egypt. But as far as the symbolism of the Bible goes, as far as the story of the Bible goes, you can call it Egypt, but it's the same idea. It's the same spirit of Babylon. That wickedness, that human solution, and incorporated into that is that pride and that abuse of other people, that mistreatment of other people. You didn't see that emphasized so much in Genesis 11, but you're definitely seeing it emphasized here. It's the anti-rest of sorts.
Yeah, I think pulling back to the Tower of Babel is important. Again, these are, connected books, connected ideas, connected pictures, and the whole pulling it back from that, again, you said, it doesn't really go into detail, like, the Tower of Babel, did they enslave people in there? Well, it probably likely.
Likely. I mean, what would Israelites have thought when they read Genesis 11? Would they have read that and call, ooh, these are just all free capitalists building this? No, they wouldn't have thought that. They would have been reminded of their own experience in Egypt. It's written in such a way to remind them of it. So Genesis 11 doesn't mention slave labor, but it's all but implying it for Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of powerful stuff here. Just setting up, again, the struggle that's going on of Pharaoh oppressing them. Here we don't have a reference back to 15, but later you do get some references back to that. But
there's also, I don't know, maybe it's just the way I think about this, sort of an inclusio, because the book begins and ends with construction projects, right? Mm-hmm. And if it's beginning with building human cities based on the oppression of the unfortunate, it ends with people freely giving things to build the house of God and to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. There's even a little word play on the distinction, the Hebrew word for the storage cities and the Hebrew for the tabernacle, the Mishkan. So it's one of those things where Israel goes from being forced to build for Pharaoh to being cheerful and glad to build for the Lord, to build what will profit Pharaoh versus to build what will help God to dwell among them. So that's part of the trajectory of the story as well.
Yeah. I think that's a neat thing that you bring up there about that transformation of, again, that we talked about that in our outline, that the first 19 chapters are kind of them leaving Pharaoh and everything that entails, and going to God, the true king, all these things. And that's just another one of those things that pulls on the part, those, that they're doing this freely. They're, the building that they're making is a moving building. It's not this permanent fixture. It's able to go with them and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's neat.
And yet another connection I would throw in is the enslavement of Israel is an anti-creation story of sorts. Because you think back to the beginning of Genesis, Genesis 1 and 2,
Yeah.
God creates the world, and then on the seventh day, he rests. What's the opposite of rest?
Yeah, this endless labor.
Endless
Yeah.
labor, hard labor. When God curses humanity and casts him out of the Garden of Eden, the curse in Genesis 3, I think Genesis 3:19 is, by the sweat of your face you will eat bread until you return to dust, because you are dust, and to dust you shall return. What's going on here? Well, their lives are made bitter with hard labor. There's a Hebrew root for servant, abad, which is used several times in verses 13 and 14. They compelled the Israelites to labor rigorously. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, and all their labors in which they rigorously, the New American Standard says, imposed on them, but it's again the word for labor. The labors which the Egyptians labored on them.
Mm-hmm.
Anti-rest story.
Yeah.
Well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is God is going to intervene, create the people of Israel anew, and bring them out to give them rest. Part of the rationale for the Sabbath law, you are to rest on the seventh day because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, but the Lord brought you out of Egypt by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm.
Yeah. I think that's, pulling it back to the Genesis creation story. You kind of saw that with the flood, where you kind of have, it's almost like a retelling of the creation story. Here, as he's creating his people, like you said, you also have, another reversal going on there, that they're made in the image of God, these people who have dominion over creation. And here, his people are slaves. That he made them so that they could have dominion. And yet, he's starting out and they're slaves here. He was going to make them into, a kingdom of priests. These people, this royal his, firstborn, his beloved son, as Abraham and Isaac and things like that. So, a lot of neat reversals, and God taking, the void and creating something out of it.
Yeah, so let's look at the Hebrew midwives, starting in verse 15. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said to them, why have you done this thing, and let the boys live? The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So there's a series of escalations there.
Yeah. I think this is one of those passages that are just really powerful. Again, one of the big contrasts that a lot of people talk about is, the Pharaoh, this big important guy, goes unnamed in this text. But these two midwives who, honor God with their fear of God, and they are named. They're recognized for what they've done. I think that was, there's a lot of discussions that go in a different direction of, does this mean lying is okay? And I think I remember you talking about this a little bit about, what that means in sight of the fear of the Lord. And
right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we start thinking about the fear of the Lord. I mean, this is one of those things more commonly brought up with the story of Rahab, right? Mm-hmm. Rahab's lie. The truth is that it's not a question of whether Rahab's going to lie. It's a question of which lie Rahab is going to tell. Yeah. She already has the spies under her roof with an implied promise to protect them. So when the Canaanite soldiers of Jericho show up and ask her about the spies, she can either lie to the soldiers and tell them, oh, they've left the city, they've gone in another way, thus redirecting them and saving their lives. Or she can lie to the people that she brought into her house by breaking her promise and turning them in. So it's a question of which lie she's going to tell in that story. And in such difficult, complex situations, judgment call situations, the answer is really obvious. What is the beginning of wisdom? Well, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And there are motives to lie that are not inspired by the fear of the Lord, but Rahab's is clearly inspired by the fear of the Lord, because her explanation to the spies entails this long description about what God has been doing for them and what she believes God is about to do in Jericho. Well, this is going on here, and in fact, the fear of the Lord motivation is spelled out even more explicitly.
Yeah.
In verse 21, because the midwives feared God,
Yeah.
is they acted the way they did, and he established households for them. Now, there is an interpretive question here, and the Bible that I'm reading, a New American Standard 95, took an interpretive stance on it, and I think most Masoretic texts in general takes a stance on it, that they are in fact Hebrew midwives.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not universally agreed upon, not historically. The Septuagint, the Vulgate, Josephus all identify the midwives not as Hebrews, but as Egyptians, which I think is interesting. And if in fact that's what's going on here, then it adds another layer to the story.
Yeah.
If the midwives are Egyptians, then they're doing this not out of loyalty to their countrymen, but out of loyalty to what is right. And they're acting as foreigners, as Egyptians, who are sort of subverting the expectations, which I think is a really... Well, which is why Pharaoh even trusted them to do this in the first place.
Yeah.
Now, that's not completely without hiccups. Shiphrah and Puah are Hebrew names, but well, then again, so is Hagar. So it's not really... those aren't deadlocks in and of itself. The midwives act the way they do because they fear God. They don't do what the king of Egypt commands them. They defy the civil authorities. You imagine that, right? There's all kinds of discussion out there on when it's okay to defy the state, when it's okay to not do what the state says. And I think there's a general agreement that no, Romans 13 and the principle of being subject to the governing authorities, that there are in fact exceptions to that, because we find them in the Bible. We find them with the apostles in Acts 4 and 5. We find them with the midwives here. We find them with Daniel, who refuses to stop praying, or with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow to a statue. When does that appear? Well, this is a pretty clear instance. Somebody's life is at stake. It's the choice between destroying innocent life and doing what the king says. Well, they're not going to be subject to the king's call to murder and destroy innocent life in this instance here.
Yeah. I have, reading this part of the passage here, and reading about, Genesis, God creating life, and especially in the New Testament, God is the author of life, that He is life, and He gives us all these things that. These are things so contrary to God's nature, and you talk, reading it, casting them into the Nile River is again, who destroys by water in the flood? That's God's judgment. Mm-hmm. Here, the king is using his judgment and using water as I'm God. I am the one in authority. I am power. And he uses water as his means of acting that out and just perverting that. I
mean, spoiler alert: God drowns the Egyptians in the Red Sea later.
Yeah.
There's a lot of lex talionis in this story, where people get their just deserts, and people get their equal retribution sort of brought back on their own head. The Egyptians drown Israelites, so God in turn drowns Egyptians. The Egyptians murder Israelite children, so God in turn kills the firstborn sons of the Egyptians in the 10th plague. This is all retributive. It's intended to be so in order to free these people from oppression. And I think that that's an important factor to keep in mind. People will sometimes read Exodus and they'll be horrified because, oh no, God's killing all these Egyptians, and He kills these people in the flood, in the Red Sea crossing, or the murder of the firstborn children. And what I think we fail to realize is we're supposed to be reading this text from the perspective of the people being liberated, from the perspective of those who had their families destroyed, had their children murdered, had their bodies sold into slavery and subjected in ways that were incredibly, incredibly unfair. The Exodus isn't a story of genocide. It's a story of liberation. It's a story of vindication, that God will eventually destroy the wrongs of this world. As surely as he stopped wicked Pharaoh, he will stop Satan himself before the end comes.
Yeah, I think that's, what you brought up about these two midwives, possibly being Egyptians when the Exodus happens. One of the things that I think we both like noting is the fact that it's a mixed multitude. It's not just the Israelites, it's even some of the Egyptians, or maybe some of the slaves from who knows where. And that it's not just the Israelites being liberated here. Pharaoh, with his ruthless rule, brought harm not just to himself, but with his stubbornness to all of Israel. I mean, not all of Israel, all of Egypt as well. With, his stubbornness, that is, continued the plagues and made his people suffer. I mean, it gets to a point near the end where his own people start crying out against him. And so when you read, this and the coming things that, God is liberating them all from Pharaoh's hard heart.
Yeah. Now, of course, we start thinking about like retribution and things like that. All the things that Pharaoh does gets retributed on him. What the midwives do, though, the midwives receive reward for what they do.
Yeah.
Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Because they saved Israelite families, God built their families. Now, Pharaoh tries to destroy Israelite families, and so in turn, his family is destroyed. But the midwives save Israelite families, and in turn, their families are built up. And Pharaoh, of course, doesn't learn from this. He doesn't have second thoughts about this. When he can't get the midwives to go along with killing these children, he resorts to having the children cast into the Nile. The Nile River, which, I mean, the Egyptian view of the Nile is interesting. It's kind of, in their minds, a god in its own right. It's the very lifeblood of Egypt. It was their reliable source of agriculture and everything else. When the Nile failed, Egypt failed, because that was how they grew their crops, frankly. Because the Nile was such an important giver and taker of life, this is very much a divine judgment thing that's going on. And when the Nile turns to blood later, well, one can't help but wonder if that's a subtle signal to Pharaoh, you did this. You shed this blood in the Nile.
Yeah.
Now look what comes back on you and on your own head.
Yeah. Just, the thing about chapter 1, talking about, these two midwives to start out. It could have started in chapter 2 with the birth of Moses.
Sure.
I think that makes sense, but it gives us, the sense of dread, this setting up all these reversals, all these things of just how bad it is. And it just really brings the Exodus, starts out it with just so much to think about in this first chapter. But
I mean, the Egyptian midwives, you kind of wonder, because what is their impact on the story, right? They're not really ever mentioned again after this point.
Yeah.
But I do think they help establish the precedent that, and I mean, admittedly, I am assuming that they are not in fact Hebrews, but are in fact Egyptians.
Yeah.
I think it's part of that ongoing story thread about how the promises of God for Israel aren't just for Israel; they are for all nations. And that though there's a very clear, if these are in fact Egyptians, then there becomes an echo of what God said to Abraham: "Blessed be those who bless you, cursed be those who curse you, and in you all nations of the earth will be blessed." In this chapter, we see people blessing and cursing Israel by their actions, midwives and Pharaoh, and we see the results based on that they are blessed and cursed in return. And so it is for all those who, and how they treat God's people. And so it is even for us in how we treat others, how we treat those made in the image of God. Do we bless or do we curse? Are we a blessing or not? That becomes, I think, the real question that Exodus 1 is putting to us.
Yeah. And that's a difficult question right there. Asking ourselves, am I being a blessing to those around us, myself, and what does that look like? It's not, if you're going around, making sure you say bless you because, someone sneezes, that's probably not a good parameter to wonder if you're blessing the people around you. But by your actions, right? Thinking about that's that's a lot to think about.
Definitely.
That's probably a good place to stop for now. We thank you all for joining us for this video. We'll pick up in chapter 2 with our next one, and we thank you for watching.
Thank you.